Good afternoon, and welcome to the People Summit. And this is day 2. And for those of you who have been with us already this morning, we thank you for continuing to be with us. And for those of you who are joining us now, we welcome you. The panel that we're going to get started here is called Whither, Algonquin Park. My name is Brad Fauteux. I'm lucky enough to be a board member with Wildlands League, and I'm honored to be your moderator here today. I did want to start with the land acknowledgement, and I wanted to acknowledge that I'm here in Toronto, Ontario, and so I acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and also to acknowledge that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. For all of these, I honor and offer respect to their elders past and present and to their children who are the elders of the future. I'm adding a bit to the acknowledgement because I think we should acknowledge that in the last 24 hours, the Senate passed Bill C-15, which provides a framework for the alignment of Canadian law with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The vote passed by a vote of 61 to 10. And it's an important step in the future elimination of the Indian Act. So having completed that acknowledgement and thanking you for listening, we're honored to have some speakers with us here today. But first, I wanted to kind of lean into this poll we've been running, and it's a true or false poll. And the poll is, logging is permitted in Algonquin Park, true or false? And so the poll results showed that 97% of people answered true. And while it's not great that logging is permitted in Algonquin Park, what is great is that most of you knew that. And so we would ask you to go and tell all your friends who don't know, because it's very important that everybody knows that in what is our premier park in Ontario, we're still cutting down trees. And so thank you for participating in the poll, and great to see that result. So in discussing Algonquin Park today, we have some great speakers who are going to take us through some great ideas. Now, starting us off today will be Peter Quinby, and Peter is the Chief Scientist with the Ancient Forest Exploration and Research in Peterborough, Ontario, although he's coming from us just outside of Algonquin Park near Powassan today. He's going to talk about the Algonquin roadless areas. Katie Krelove will follow, and she's an Ontario campaigner with the Wilderness Committee. And she's going to present about why it's really time to end logging in Algonquin Park. Dave Pearce is going to join us after that. And Dave is the Senior Forest Conservation Manager with Wildlands League. And Dave has this great video for us called Logging in Algonquin Park. And we'll ask you to pay special attention to Dave's fashion choices in the video. After that, we're going to be joined by Mathieu St-Laurent Addison. And Mathieu is a conservation coordinator with CPAWS Ottawa Valley. And Mathieu is a little delayed in joining us, and so he's not with us yet. And so we hope to have him on in time. And Mathieu will be discussing Algonquin Park to the Dumoine River. And then finally, at the end of the session today, we're going to have Anna Baggio join us, and she's conservation director with Wildlands League. She's going to be the receiver, and so she's going to take questions from people. We'll have a moderated Q in the end with Anna at the end of the session. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be watching what comes in, and we'll be sharing that with the presenters at the end of the session. Any questions we don't have time to answer will be answered in follow-up materials post the event. Speakers, for you, it's very important that we're on time, and so you'll get a gentle warning from our technology supports as we're getting close to the end of that time. And, you know, because we're in a Zoom environment for the last year and more, it's important to remember this is a technology event. So if the technology becomes an issue at some point, we'll have a pause, and rest assured that we've got some great folks working on that to resolve it as quickly as possible. And so to get us started, I'm going to turn to my friend, Mr. Quinby here, or Dr. Quinby, and he's going to start off with Algonquin roadless areas.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Hopefully, can everyone hear me? Good, okay. Yeah, well, I did a bit of a comparison between Algonquin and an area to the west of Algonquin that I call the Georgian Bay Lake Nipissing region. And I've also focused in a bit on Algonquin in some detail. But first, I'd like to just start out with a definition, and talk a little bit also about like why we should focus on roadless areas. So what's a roadless area? It's a geographical area devoid of both roads, including primary, secondary, and tertiary, and disturbance from logging, mining, and hydroelectric development. So we're talking about an area without roads and without major human disturbance. The distance between a road and a roadless area is determined by the individuals doing the analysis, but it often ranges between 500 meters and 5 kilometers, but it can be set at any distance that one chooses to use. Minimum roadless areas are often used to avoid massive data sets and small areas of little ecological value. But for this study of Algonquin and its neighboring region, we used a 1 kilometer buffer with no size limitation in order to provide the most accurate comparison results. Very little previous work has been done on roadless areas in Ontario, or even in Canada for that matter. It's a concept that has been well developed in the US and in other parts of the world, but it's very little work's been done here. Our broader work on roadless areas in Ontario shows that they decreased by 3.1 million hectares between 2005 and 2020, about a 15-year period. This resulted in an annual loss of roughly 207,000 hectares per year of roadless areas in Ontario. Why should we focus on roadless areas? Well, IBESH et al. Did a study of roadless areas globally. Okay, so we're looking at the entire Earth. They published their results in Science Magazine in 2016, and just taking a quote from their study, they say that roads fragment landscapes and trigger human colonization and degradation of ecosystems to the detriment of biodiversity and ecosystem functions. The planet's remaining large and ecologically important tracts of roadless areas sustain key refugia for biodiversity and provide globally relevant ecosystem services. Earth's terrestrial surface is fragmented into about 600,000 patches, more than half of which are less than 1 square kilometer in size. Only 7% of these roadless areas are larger than 10,000 hectares. Now, this is globally. Global protection of ecologically valuable roadless areas at 9.3% is inadequate. International recognition and protection of roadless areas is urgently needed to halt their continued loss. Limiting road expansion into roadless areas may prove to be the most cost-effective way of achieving strategically important global biodiversity and sustainability goals. Next slide. Okay, so it's a little difficult to see all of the roads that exist within Algonquin Park, but the small black lines that you see are roads, and the green areas are the roadless areas that remain in Algonquin. Otherwise, it's primarily logging that has resulted in the building of these roads. As I said, we used a 1 kilometer buffer. If we were to decrease that buffer, we would see a little bit more roadless area, but a 1 kilometer buffer is a pretty standard distance to use when doing a roadless areas analysis. So one of the things you'll notice, and we've discovered that there's roughly about maybe around 6,200 kilometers of road within Algonquin. Now, there's likely more. We don't have a full assessment of all the roads that are there yet. But an interesting comparison just with this slide is to look at how dense those roads are within Algonquin. And you can see some patches outside of Algonquin that actually have a lower road density. like over in like to just in the southern part of the western region that borders the park, and then up in the northwestern corner, you can see some areas that are devoid of roads. So it's kind of interesting that outside the park you actually have um, larger roadless areas. Well, so you still have some roadless areas where there is actually no park designation. Next slide, please. Oops. Well, I don't know why that happened, but the purpose of this slide is to show that the purple areas are roadless areas that are protected. The green areas are the roadless areas that are unprotected. And it's a little difficult to see the beige areas, but they're the other protected areas. Anything that shows up as white is available for logging and has likely been logged. Next slide, please. So the comparison I did was basically what I thought was I would look for an area near Algonquin that also had some roadless areas and try to draw a boundary around that other area that would show like a total size that was roughly equivalent to Algonquin. And I think that, as I recall, the Georgian Bay Lake Nipissing region that's outlined in red to the west of Algonquin is about 1,200 hectares larger than Algonquin. But you can see that there's more roadless areas in this region that is not designated as a park. In fact, 28% of the area of that Georgian Bay Lake Nipissing region is made up of roadless areas, whereas Algonquin has 18% roadless area. Next slide. This one's also a little fuzzy here, but basically looking at those comparison bars, if you go look at the first bar, that's just basically showing that the two regions have a very similar size. The second comparison bars, that shows the amount protected in each region, and the brown is the Georgian Bay Lake Nipissing region. The blue is Algonquin. But when you get to the next bar, that's basically the total of the roadless areas. You can see that brown bar is much higher than the blue one. In fact, it's 80,000 hectares higher or larger than the blue one. So basically, the Georgian Bay Lake Nipissing area has 80,000 more hectares of roadless area than Algonquin. The next two bars that are comparing roadless areas protected and roadless areas unprotected. Now, Algonquin has the Georgian Bay Lake Nipissing area beat in terms of the area protected. But I think the key number here is simply how much more roadless area there is in an area that's not even designated as a park. The numbers are all provided in that table below, and if people want to go back and kind of study those numbers, you know, that's why I included that table, but I'm not going to worry about describing it in detail right now. All right, next slide. So in conclusion, in Algonquin Park, only 18% of the areas composed of roadless areas, which many define as true wilderness, and almost 40,000 hectares of roadless areas in Algonquin are unprotected, currently unprotected from logging. Whereas in the Georgian Bay Lake Nipissing region, which is not a park, an area is roughly equal to the size of Algonquin. Roadless areas compose 28% of the area, representing 80,000 hectares more than in Algonquin. Thus, although it's a park, Algonquin has much lower ecological integrity and wilderness character at the landscape level compared to an adjacent region lacking park designation. So my final sort of conclusion or statement, in my opinion, logging should be removed from Algonquin before the entire park loses its original ecological integrity. And based on some work done that came out recently, done by, I think, what's his name? Oh, I have his book. Oh yeah, done by Seth Klein. And he's got this great book called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. He determined that starting in the mid-90s, the managed forest of Canada became a source of CO2 as opposed to a sink. All right, and the central part of Ontario has one of the highest intensities of timber extraction, according to some of his work. So now basically the managed forest of Ontario can no longer consider to store and sequester carbon as on the positive side of the carbon use equation. It's now emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. Just another reason why we need to move quickly on protecting more natural areas in Ontario, and why not start with Ontario's flagship park, Algonquin. So it really wouldn't be that hard to do, given that there's a huge demand for more recreation areas, and biodiversity is in we have a biodiversity crisis, we have a climate crisis, and forests, especially old growth forests, are perfect, a perfect choice for sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere. So the longer we wait, the worse the situation's going to get. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Peter. That was really comprehensive in terms of that analysis. It's great to have the comparison of the park versus the non-park, and to show that the ecological character of the park, which should be more conserved and more protected, is actually less. And of course, road mortality from a species perspective is a significant factor in species loss and loss of biodiversity. And so highlighting roads, which a number of different organizations have done as a key driver in a loss of biodiversity, is a really important thing to focus on. Appreciate that. Thank you very much, Peter.
Sure.
So we move from Peter, and we've got our friends Katie Krelove here, and Katie's going to talk us about what's up with logging in Algonquin Park. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Brad. Yep, so my name is Katie Krelove. I am the Wilderness Committee's Ontario campaigner. And the Wilderness Committee does advocate for an end to logging in Algonquin Park and all parks. Although Algonquin is the only one in Ontario where logging is still permitted. And we do this for what may seem like a simplistic reason, that industry does not belong in protected areas, is incompatible essentially with the aim of protected areas. And while that seems like a simple notion, it is one that seems to get lost in the discussion about Algonquin. And often it's put forward that the sustainable logging that happens in Algonquin is as good as protection. So I think it's worth, for my presentation, I want to sort of get back to basics and back to this sort of fundamental notion of why that is not so. And so the quote that I love from Gord Miller, the former Ontario Environmental Commissioner, from his 2014 report, which called for an end of logging in Ontario, in Algonquin Park, is there is a fundamental difference between logging sustainably and maintaining the ecological integrity of a protected area. And then another quote from a more recent, the Auditor General's 2020 annual report, Conserving the Natural Environment with Protected Areas, states that 2/3 of Algonquin Park does not meet the national criteria for protected area. And if all of Algonquin met the criteria, it would increase the total provincial protected coverage by about 0.5%, which is not an insubstantial number. Next slide. All right, so again, to get back to basics, the Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act of Ontario sets out the mandate and the intentions and the rules for protected parks and conservation reserves in the province. And it prioritizes by law ecological integrity as the primary concern for for management of protected parks and conservation reserves, and also bans industry for that purpose. So acknowledging that industry is not compatible with prioritizing ecological integrity. Whereas the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, which is the sort of legal regime under which forestry is managed in the province, only requires balance of values. So while environmental ecological values are spoken to in that, they are not prioritized. Ontario has recently exempted forestry in the province from another legal, from the Environmental Assessment Act, which means that individual environmental assessments for particular forests can no longer be requested by concerned citizens. The effects of logging in Algonquin Park has never had a comprehensive assessment to determine the ecological impacts on the park, on the species in the park. And then the lightening the footprint endeavor in 2005, in 2005, when the Provincial Parks Act was under review, the MNR at the time did ask for advice from Ontario Parks Board to lighten the ecological footprint of logging in Algonquin Park. So an admission basically that logging does have a footprint on the ecology of the park. And so though it recognized the problem, it didn't go far enough. And it's important to point out that at that time, the Ontario Parks Board did propose increasing protection in the park from what at that point was 22% to 54% of the park. But in the end, what came out was actually only an increase to 35%. And a lot of the percentages of protection that was added at that time really emphasized recreational canoe routes, but added very little to nature reserve or wilderness zones in the park. And also failed to identify and protect tracts of pristine old growth that were still unprotected in the park. So that process overall reduced the impact of logging on recreation of the park, but not on the ecological footprint of the park. Next slide. Oh, sorry, stay for a sec. So I just want to show you another impact on the photo there is actually from Google Earth and shows another impact of logging in the park, which is a gravel pit. So it's also the only park where gravel extraction, which is used to build the roads, the logging roads in the park is allowed. So, and those are relatively permanent footprints. Next slide. So similarly, I'll talk a little bit about protections for species at risk and provincially significant species. So under the Crown Forest Sustainability Act requires only that the effects of logging on species at risk be minimized, mitigated, whereas the Endangered Species Act requires critical habitat to be protected and recovered. So it's much held to a much higher level. And again, it's important to note that the logging in Algonquin Park and across the province is exempt from the Endangered Species Act and was just permanently made so. So there is a much lower level of criteria for endangered species protection in the unprotected parks, the log parts of Algonquin. And then again, monitoring, which again, monitoring of endangered species in the park. Again, there's sort of no comprehensive monitoring that goes on for the overall effects of logging on those species. Another thing to note is that the park management plan, which oversees the management of the entire park, is now almost 3 years overdue. So it was supposed to be reviewed in 2018, but has yet to happen. And another thing I want to point out is that sort of the ecological impact, another ecological impact of logging in the park, whereas 65% is managed for logging and logging roads rather than recreational uses, results in the overcrowding of the protected areas of the park, which I'm sure many people are aware of, especially in the past years with COVID, is increasingly becoming a problem in our protected places. And I'll just point out also that the ongoing Algonquins of Ontario land claim process that is happening includes no areas of Algonquin Park. Next slide. And so Peter rightly pointed out that on Canada's forests have now become a carbon source instead of sink. And that was confirmed in the recent inventory of carbon sources that was submitted by Canada to the Committee of the Parties, the COP process. And so to focus right now on old growth, enhancing Canada's climate change ambitions with nature-based solutions do often center around our ability to keep carbon stored in especially in old growth. So this is a recommendation from a study done by Risa Smith, who works with IUCN, and one of the main recommendations was targeted protection to protect threatened, intact, carbon-dense, high biodiversity ecosystems is the most effective natural climate solution to 2030. And then the concept of pro-forestation is similar to grow 30% of Canada's forests over 60 years old to their ecological potential. So beyond even forests that are already in an old growth state, pro-forestation involves conserving those forests that are almost in an old growth state, so that to allow them to achieve that carbon storage. And in that study, it's shows that 4.8 megatons of carbon could be stored, is stored in the unprotected old growth forests of Algonquin Park. And the Crown Forest Sustainability Act has no criteria for assessing carbon storage vis-a-vis forests and forestry. Next slide. All right, so I just want to leave you with a couple of maps here that kind of go along with some of Peter's points. So the 10-year forest management planning process for Algonquin Park, where they plan where and what to log over the next 10 years, has just recently wrapped up. So we have the new 10-year plan. And so what we did was we mapped projected or what is planned to be logged over the next 10 years with sort of identified or potential old growth stands in Algonquin Park, the unprotected parts. So in this, you can see the old growth, the blue and the red represents areas where proposed harvest overlaps with old growth or potential old growth stands. So I think this really shows that sort of the unsustainability or cuts into the claims of sustainability of logging in Algonquin Park because of the need to go further and further into old growth. Kind of belies claims to sustainability. And the next slide, please, shows a similar thing. So here we've overlapped the planned logging roads to be built in Algonquin Forest over the next 10 years, as per the forest management plan that was just produced, where they overlap with what Peter was talking about, roadless areas in Algonquin Park. So the red you can see is where new proposed roads actually are going into those roadless areas. Again, sort of belying the claims to sustainability of logging in the park. So I'll end there, last slide. And I mean, it was really great that so many people were aware that there's logging in Algonquin Park on from our poll. A lot of people still are not. And even users of the park, recreational users of the park, are not aware. Most people are shocked when they find out, and we are really trying to do outreach and raise awareness and make a call to the Premier of Ontario that it is time to make a plan to end logging in Algonquin Park. So you can see some of our action tools there, our hashtag #endparklogging, and you can check out the Wilderness Committee website to find out more. Thanks, everyone.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Katie. And what a great presentation. The use of maps is such a helpful tool, particularly to point out all the different kinds of zones within the park itself. And of course, the Lightening the Footprint Amendment, which actually I had a hand in signing into being many, many years later, was very recreationally focused. It's a really important thing to remember. And I will also relay to you that in international circles, the IUCN still refers to Algonquin Park as the Algonquin Timber Reserve. And I recall meeting with the Director General in Australia at the Parks Congress, where she shook my hand and very icily said to me, "How is the Algonquin Park Timber Reserve?" And so the rest of the world is looking at us in that regard. And the last thing I would offer, of course, is that we've taken logging out of provincial parks before. And so Lake Superior Provincial Park, and it would be great for someone to study what we all know would be the dramatic increase in ecological integrity of that park once logging was removed. Anyway, wonderful presentation and great work at Wilderness Committee. Thank you very much. And so we move from here, and actually we move into a video, and our colleague Dave Pearce from Wildlands League is going to take you through a video presentation. And so Dave and our technology folks, I'll turn that over to you.
Like almost 1 million people each year, I've enjoyed Algonquin many times in many seasons, from dodging moose as they wade meandering streams in the springtime, to winter camping when the wolves just make your spine tingle with their howls. There are many great things about Algonquin, including old-growth forests and world-class brook trout lakes. It's a place where northern evergreens and southern deciduous forests meet and mingle, and it's a refuge for Algonquin wolves, a much-loved but threatened species. But one thing that stuns me is that we still allow logging in this famous park. One poll ranked Algonquin only second to Banff National Park in terms of national recognition. Many people don't realize that beyond limited areas of real protection and buffers along canoe routes, logging, road building, and gravel mining are still permitted in 65% of the park. In fact, over 5,000 kilometers of logging roads fracture the park. These roads have huge impacts. They're reused every few years, so they're effectively forever. So, it's a permanent loss of forest land and carbon storage. Roads also provide a route for destructive invasive species into the park interior, and they menace brook trout lakes and streams with erosion. Logging and its impacts have no place in a park. By law, the Ontario government is supposed to manage Algonquin for ecological integrity to make sure that the health of the ecosystem is paramount in all they do. They can't do that in Algonquin and still permit logging. Now, proponents of logging Algonquin cite jobs as a reason to continue the practice, but the Ontario government has already identified an additional 100,000 hectares that could be protected right away without reducing logging. It has just chosen not to protect these areas because it's easier to build roads through them when they're not protected. Meanwhile, only half the area available to be cut has been logged in the last 10 years. Therefore, there is a further large amount of land that doesn't need to be logged and can be added to protection. So the 24,000 hectares of old-growth forest that's currently unprotected could be saved and still not reduce the number of logs going to local mills. The amount of logging occurring outside the park is down too. There should be enough wood available outside the park to move logging completely outside of Algonquin. We are in the midst of a global climate and ecological crisis. Most experts are saying we need to protect up to 50% of our land and water to keep the health of the planet. And national governments around the world are pledging to reach 30% protection by 2030. Yet, Ontario seems to be content to be stuck at 10% protection. Even worse, Doug Ford is rolling back logging regulations and wetland protections outside of parks. It's time for the province to show leadership. One way they could do this is to move logging outside of Algonquin and bring a restoration plan to the park. We know this can be done. Wildlands League is calling on the Ontario government to end logging in Algonquin Park, immediately suspend logging of the old growth, immediately protect brook trout lakes and streams, and quickly shut down and restore 40% of the roads in the park. But we need your help. This is your park, and your voice is important. You can go to our Algonquin Take Action page, located here. There, you can sign up for our updates and ask the Ontario government to stop logging in Algonquin. You can share this information through your networks as well to help. Thank you.
It's a great video, Dave. Thank you very much for that. And you'll notice that Dave is apparently wearing the identical outfit as Avatar Dave in the video. So it's really a true to life video, Dave.
Can I make a couple comments?
Please.
Good. Anna makes a guest appearance there, and I wish she'd worn her pink blazer, because that's her signature uniform. And I've got to credit our outreach team at Wildlands League for doing, and our new hire Katie for doing some amazing graphics there. So I had very little except my voice engaged in that. So I kind of took the easy way out today, but I'm here for questions. So throw me the tough ones. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dave. And as everyone recalls, we'll have questions at the end. It's great to see some of those graphic representations. And, removing logging from the park is not just an ecological and environmental exercise, but it's a social and cultural exercise. And so, while we know for the ecological integrity of the park that it's important too that we address those other issues around sawmills, around jobs and economy and the history of logging in the park. And so it's nice to see those addressed in the video as well, Dave, because there's a lot of considerations there, although ecological integrity of the park should be the primary one. Well, thank you very much. We'll move from that. We've got Mathieu St-Laurent Addison here, and Mathieu works for CPAWS Ottawa Valley. He's the Conservation Projects Coordinator, and Mathieu is going to talk about Algonquin Park to the Dumoine River. And so please proceed, Mathieu. Nice to have you.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Mathieu St-Laurent Addison. I work as the Conservation Projects Coordinator for CPAWS Ottawa Valley. And as part of the People's Summit today, we'll present you an opportunity to expand protected areas between Algonquin Park in Eastern Ontario and the Dumoine River in southwestern Quebec. So I'll briefly introduce you to the work of CPAWS, and then I will talk about the importance of connectivity between existing protected areas in the region and why it matters on a larger scale. So before I start the presentation, I would like to acknowledge that we work from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So thank you for the next slide. Just to give you some background information, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society is a nationwide charity that has been dedicated to the protection of nature on public lands for over 50 years. So we work in collaboration with all levels of government, Indigenous and local communities, industry, and other environmental groups to establish protected areas and ensure they are effectively managed to protect nature within them. And it is important that governments move forward with conservation targets to protect at least 30% of land and waters by 2030 in a framework of reconciliation. So next slide, please. So the Ottawa Valley chapter of CPAWS OV, works to protect public lands in the Ottawa River watershed and adjoining parts of Eastern Ontario and Southwestern Quebec. So here you can see a map of existing protected areas in our region, along with ongoing conservation projects. So only about 8.7% of the Ottawa River watershed is protected, compared to about 11% for the province of Ontario and 17% in Quebec. So the good news is there are potential sites for conservation, as you've seen in the last presentations, and also such as the territory between the Algonquin Park and the Dumoine River, the Coulonge River's watersheds, the Madawaska Highlands, and much more. So if we only take these sites that I just mentioned into consideration and add their total proposed areas to the 8.7%, we would be right around 11% protection for the Ottawa River watershed. So there's still a lot of work to do to respond to our region's deficit in terms of protected areas. So next slide, please. So just to explain why we use that approach to calculate the percentage of protected areas in the region, I'll give you an overview of the watershed concept. So watershed is the total area of land drained by a major river and its tributaries. So its boundaries are the highest elevation points that determine the direction of water flow into the mainstream. So everything within these natural limits is connected. So what happens in one part of the watershed affects other parts. So for example, in the industrial forest, logging and road networks fragment the landscape and disturb natural drainage patterns, which lead to erosion and unstable conditions. And on top of that, second growth forests don't provide the same multi-layered habitat complexity as old growth forests. So these impacts on the landscape and waterways contribute to habitat loss and degradation, which is the main threat and driver of species decline. So using the watershed approach to conservation is an alternative to using political boundaries and being limited in managing protected areas effectively. So next slide, please. So today I'm going to focus on the territory between Algonquin Park and the Dumoine River. So to briefly put things into context, this region of interest for connectivity between the two larger protected areas is in the county of Renfrew. That's right between North Bay and Pembroke districts, just north of the Algonquin Park here. So most of public land in that area are subjected to general land use or enhanced management. And as you can see from the map, there are 4 small protected areas within the territory. So Bissett Creek, Grants Creek, and Driftwood Provincial Park, as well as Greenbow Esker Conservation Reserve. So next slide, please. So the general use area designation is the default status given to a territory in Ontario and can be reviewed for a more appropriate designation. So the region between the Algonquin Park and the Dumoine River is at risk due to ongoing forestry operation, mining, and potential energy developments. So looking at this map from the Global Forest Watch, you can see the region has lost more tree cover than it has gained over the last 20 years. So there are still large tracts of intact forest landscapes with high conservation value within that area. And these are important for safeguarding biodiversity and for a wide range of ecosystem services. And besides having resilient landscapes, regions with a more extensive network of protected areas support thriving communities with potential green jobs and recreational tourism opportunities. So we no longer need to depend exclusively on resource extraction if governments commit to move forward with conservation targets. Next slide, please. So the Algonquin Park to the Dumoine River region is also located within the territory covered by the Algonquin Nation's land claim. And as the Ministry of Natural Resource and the Algonquin Nations are negotiating land use, it's important that the region is explored with a biodiversity conservation approach, as well as through cultural heritage values determined by the Algonquins. So next slide, please. So by protecting this area, increased habitat will be provided to species at risk, such as the Algonquin wolf, and will support their migration to regions of Quebec. So this will also provide a continentally significant connection between the Algonquin to Adirondacks and the boreal forest to the north. This map was taken from the Wildlands Network, which is an environmental group in the United States. And the darker shade of green represent potential core natural areas, and the lighter shade represent potential habitat corridors. So, which are components of the territory that facilitate movement of species and ecosystem processes between areas of relatively intact habitat. So next slide, please. As you can see, most of the region land cover is forested landscapes. So a general observation on the satellite maps, you can see the brown color scheme patches are the recent forestry cut blocks. The lighter shade of green are the second growth forests, and the darker shade of green, most likely the old growth forests. This region of relatively intact forest landscape, provincially significant wetland, rich biodiversity, and streams draining into the Ottawa River is particularly key to maintaining connectivity between Algonquin Park and the boreal forests of Western Quebec. So connectivity is important to maintain viable ecosystems and wildlife populations as it facilitates species adaptations, especially in the context of climate change. So we know species are being found further north and at higher elevation than their normal range because of rising temperatures and shifting vegetation patterns, which moves their habitat distribution. So our recommendations for the Ontario government would be to increase the size of these 4 small disconnected protected areas and to potentially establish more protected areas in that region. So next slide, please. So the design of protected areas is an important aspect of conservation. Their size and shape need to be large enough to support natural processes such as foraging, predator-prey relationships, reproduction, dispersal, seasonal migration, and the interplay between natural disturbances and succession. So we need to accommodate species for changing environmental conditions. And some animals need a large territory to roam, and that requires a connected network of protected areas. So next slide, please. So CPAWS OV has been working to establish and connect protected areas for a long time. So we're currently working on the Dumoine, Noir, and Coulonge campaigns to ensure permanent protection of 1,800 square kilometers for the Dumoine and 1,150 square kilometers for the Noir and Coulonge rivers watersheds. So the Dumoine is one of the last undammed river in southwestern Quebec and currently benefits from an interim protection status. So the 2 adjacent rivers, the Noir and Coulonge, are also under a moratorium on industrial activities and are currently under a proposal for a new protected area. So these rivers that flow along north-south corridors are important for connectivity as they enhance the potential for wildlife to migrate in response to climate change and are key for the conservation of biodiversity. So they're also popular whitewater canoeing destinations and offer an opportunity to develop the recreotourism sector and diversify the local economy. So next slide, please. So the next steps for the Algonquin Park to the Dumoine initiative are to work with local Indigenous communities, NGOs, industry, and engage governments to get involved in financing research, exploration, and a consultation process to expand protected areas in the region and improve their management. So we'll keep supporting conservation efforts from other groups in the region, and we'll continue to collaborate to get these special places protected. So feel free to connect with us and follow our work on our website and social media, and both are available in French and English. Thank you very much.
Merci, and thank you, Mathieu. That was really great. Mathieu brings about a really interesting perspective, of course, which is a lot of this protection is done with the provincial border sticking out in the middle. And getting those two governments to work together can be very hard. Not only, and it also brings to mind the idea that, a lot of the conservation values are also running into recreational values. The Dumoine and the Coulanges and the Noir are great rivers to paddle, right? As is the recreation value attached to most of the Ottawa River and the Outaouais and the valley there. And so it's interesting to think about the kind of correlation between recreation values and protection values. But the cross-border stuff is really, really difficult to do from a public policy perspective. And so organizations like CPAWS OV really do great work on the ground to be able to have that conversation be between those provinces. And of course, the consideration for all of that is the Algonquin land claim, which is the largest land claim in Ontario's history, and which has significant Crown land transfers throughout the claim area, including, Camp Island on the Mattawa and some other real significant areas not far from these areas you're describing, Mathieu. So it's a great presentation. Thank you very much. And it's also important because that part of Algonquin Park, the northeastern part, is, I think, one of the least understood parts of the park more generally. And the Jack Pine Forest and the very different ecology that you have up in those areas, leading across to Bissett Creek into the Ottawa. That's a part of the province that I think a lot of Ontarians, if you don't live in that valley, you just don't know it. And so certainly it's nice to put an attention on a really, really underappreciated part of Algonquin. And of course, Algonquin does need to change, and expanding the park as a conversation that hasn't been happening. And so it's great to think about where we could actually make the park bigger. That's really terrific. So merci and thank you, Mathieu. So we have reached the point of our discussion today, where we're into the Q&A. And so our colleague Anna Baggio is here, who has been receiving questions. And Anna, I'm going to ask you to moderate and take over from now in terms of the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you all the presenters, and thank you for your great questions, people out there. You're doing a great job, and you can send them in. I'm still receiving, so I'm happy to take more questions, and we've got lots of great people that want to answer them. I'm going to give an easy one to Peter just to kind of put everybody on the same page, because Peter's mentioned the managed forest, and I know we all talk a lingo, and I just want Peter, can you just quickly tell the audience what a managed forest means for those who may not know?
Well, I guess the simplest way to say it is that the managed forest are the forests where trees are cut and where those trees are removed as timber to be taken to the market and sold.
Wonderful, thank you. That's what we like. To the point, merci. So I got a really good question off the top. Has anyone recently studied the economic impact of eliminating logging in Algonquin? And who would like to take that first?
So I'll just say we haven't done a full analysis, although the environmental commissioner back, and Katie quoted Gord Miller, they did a certain amount of analysis about the capacity to remove logging over time from Algonquin and transfer that demand outside the park. So, and then our rough analysis, which is in my video, which is, we're logging less than half of what the allowable harvest is in Algonquin, and then we've got reduced demand outside. So just an off the top of the head sort of analysis of the general situation thinks, well, it's a pretty good chance we could move that outside, and you wouldn't lose actually any timber volume necessarily from just protecting Algonquin fully.
Thank you, Dave.
You know, I'll chime in for a second. If we were to
Oh,
remove
sure.
logging from Algonquin Park, we would be removing less than 1% of Ontario's entire productive forest cover. So if you were to put it in the context of all the available productive logging cover in the entire province, Algonquin Park areas available for logging are less than 1%. And that comes directly from the ministry's recognition of productive forest cover area.
Good addition, Brad. Thank you. Katie, this one's for you. Your comment on logging being exempt from the ESA may be true, but is it not true that all SFLs operating in the park are FSC certified companies?
From my understanding, the companies operating in Algonquin Park are not FSC certified. But FSC certification doesn't actually enhance the protections for endangered species from logging. So it doesn't enhance what the Crown Forest Sustainability Act already has in terms of protecting species at risk, which, as I mentioned, is just the duty to mitigate or minimize harm. And again, that's a tricky term, right? So what does it mean to minimize or mitigate harm? And how do we know if that harm has been minimized enough by logging? Whereas with the Endangered Species Act, there's a much more proactive and stronger legislation to protect, to avoid harm at all, and to recover, right? And to recover species habitat. And that goes for species populations as well as their critical habitat. So yeah, I mean, from what I understand, Algonquin company, the AFA, which manages logging in Algonquin, is not FSC certified, and even if it were, it wouldn't add any extra protections.
Thanks for that, Katie. Mathieu, I have one for you. What's the first thing you need to see happen to achieve a linkage between Algonquin and Dumoine?
Well, so in a collaborative effort, we need environmental groups to work together. We need to convince the public, and we need commitment from, ultimately, we need commitment from decision makers to either expand or create new protected areas in that sector.
Yes, we do. Peter, I have one for you. In terms of the two areas you looked at, Algonquin and then the Nipissing Georgian Bay area, one question that came in said, was there a difference in the topography, elevation, geological formation, and was this considered when calculating the % of roadless areas for both areas?
No, I mean, it probably would be an interesting sort of additional component to do that, but when it comes right down to it, a roadless area is simply defined as an area a certain distance away from roads without major human disturbance, right? It's not a roadless area. It doesn't matter what kind of geology it is or what kind of topography it is. I think that kind of information could be useful in terms of understanding recreational potential and non-destructive uses, but that kind of information isn't really central to identifying and characterizing roadless areas.
Thank you for that. And while I have you, and perhaps you covered this, but just in case, I want to make sure the audience gets everything they asked for. How much of Algonquin is old growth forest?
Well, the 24,000 hectare number is a really old number. Sorry, Dave. So it's really closer to around, it's actually, I think it's more than 100,000 hectares, but The 24,000 hectare number comes from using just one minimum age, and that's 140 years. But in fact, if you look at the minimum age of every single species that can dominate in an old growth forest, so for example, the black spruce becomes old growth at 90 years old, and you apply every minimum age, which is different. Like some species have the same minimum age, but there's probably at least 8 to 10 different minimum ages that you can have in Algonquin. So when you apply that in a more detailed analysis, it expands the amount of old growth that's there. The other thing you have to look at is that there's two data sets. There's a 1987 FRI data set that they'll tell you the age of the forest. And there's I think it's a 2007 FRI data set that you can use. So both have merit, and sometimes the older data does a better job of characterizing what's there. Sometimes the newer data does a better job, but we don't know in what cases each data set is a better choice. So if we use both data sets and we use the minimum ages for every species, I'm sure it's more than 100,000 hectares of old growth in Algonquin.
Wow. And most of that's unprotected. Is that true?
Well, I do have those numbers somewhere, not right off the top of my head, but that's a good question. I hate to talk about numbers when I have them, but I don't have them at my fingertips. So I'm happy to follow up on that though.
No, that'd be great. No, we always appreciate accuracy. If you don't have it, don't try and make it up. We don't, that's okay. We're good with that. Thank you,
no, you can get into deep doo-doo doing that. So.
Totally. Another question, if there was a removal of road use, do you also propose to stop maintaining backcountry camping? Dave, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I don't see how one relates to the other. The backcountry camping is mostly in the existing wilderness zones and along the canoe routes, and neither one has current road access. So with very limited exceptions, and there's some informal campsites that we used. I worked in live trapping flying squirrels for a PhD student off the Acre Road, on Sec Lake, for example, and some others that people probably use. So I think that it would be a very limited impact.
Although it's illegal to use logging roads to incur into the park, we all know that logging roads, old and new, are being used every day, whether it's ATV or 4x4 use into the park or access to other lakes that, are protected for particular reasons. Access is such a tricky conversation. And so, we really try not to mix up recreation with logging roads, because there's there's a liability for the Crown Corporation, obviously, for Ontario Parks and others. But logging roads are designed to get places where recreation may not be designed to get to. And so there's always been a natural tension there.
Good point.
I would just say that that basically, if logging is removed from Algonquin Park, obviously there's all kinds of recreational uses that could go on in a park, and I know that mountain biking is one recreational activity that does happen in parks. Now, if you already have a system of roads, why not use some of them? If you're not going to have logging anymore, use some of them for mountain biking.
And just to bring the perspective from the Quebec side, right around the Dumoine protected areas that I just introduced, there are outfitters for hunting and fishing, and canoe camping and other recreational opportunities. And the challenge for these people is accessibility as well, because people use logging roads to access the outfitters, and if they're we remove logging from the equation, then who's going to work to maintain the roads? And so that's another part where, well, the government needs to finance these issues.
Thanks, Mathieu. I see Marilyn has her hand up. Marilyn, do you have something you'd like to add?
How many days have we got? Okay, what I'm not hearing here is enough Indigenous inclusion. A couple of things that I would recommend is contact the Ontario Native Women's Association, because in our culture, first woman is female. Trees are stand tall children of female. It would be interesting to hear what they would have to say in terms of the devastation of the natural world. And that's our obligation to look after those things. The second place that I would speak to, actually, there's a couple. But first, the Wikwemikong settlement of Point Grundine, what the people of the territory have done with the lands that have been back into repatriation of Collins Inlet, Beaverstone Bay. My family, my grandfather, my mother's father is actually born in Beaverstone Bay. So I do have a connection there, but the people of Wikwemikong would be a handsome invitation. And I know that they work quite closely with Ontario Parks and Killarney, both giving one another support systems. So those are things that I'm concerned about. In terms of other work that I've done here in the territory, I've been born and raised here, so this is a longevity for me. As you know, people that have worked in Ontario Parks, the gift, the natural gifts, creators' natural gifts. There was one that was uncovered by a blowover from natural causes. It turned a pine over, and there's a beautiful natural stone rock canoe that's been uncovered. It is absolutely beautiful to look at. It is not a physical canoe as we would know it. This is a formation of canoes, and what the centers of the canoe, there's actually two together, a larger one, and it looks like a rope tethering to a smaller one. And in our understanding of that is that that's a transference of knowledge. That's another mark for us to remind ourselves of Anishinaabeg value, the transference of knowledge, that cultural care. So these are things that when, everything gets, cut down for 20 bucks, how many 20 bucks are you going to have? How many times can you cut down a tree? What is old growth? Do we cut our elders down? And basically that's what's being said here. It's very painful to, to feel that. I hear your passion as well. But I would ask those questions. The other thing too, the Algonquin peoples, there's lots of villages that surround that traditional territory, their passageways. When you talk about canoe routes and things like that, and how the trails, natural trails were, our people walked those trails because it was a natural migration of animals. So they carved out the trails to make it a little bit easier. My grandparents used to talk about being over here. They would leave, it get lit up around that way, and travel to Toronto. And how they said the travel route, canoeing down to Penetanguishene, and getting horse walks and things like that. My grandma used to like to have special medicines that you could only harvest over in those territories. So when you start depleting everything, you lose everything. There's no balance. So I encourage you, and I admire your tenacity and how you're thinking as a collective group. If I was 20 years younger, I'd be in there with my boots on too, but now you'd have to call me on a go-kart. Oh, did I say that? Anyway, we just keep working hard. But but again, you know, if I can help you with Indigenous connections, then that would be good, because there's lots of them, and we all speak the same value, the same hurt, the same emotions, and it's really hard not to become emotional about things, because loss is forever. The other thing too, you know, in relationship to the people, how they lived here wasn't in the same kind of housing like for today. They lived close to the land, with the land, and in means with the land, because that's what there was. And when you start to disturb the growth of the trees there, you might be also destroying a history that we can still learn from. Example, where I live out here on an island is actually the first trading post in this territory. And when I look at the map that goes with the find of this, we still have natural stone walls, and it's in one of the most remains that you can actually see. We didn't know that, but we know it now. So when you look at the map of from here, I face the east, face mainland. So when you look at this map of Chautauqua River, like, you know, automatically, well, where's the roads and where's the trains? There wasn't anything. This is 1735, where this map is hand drawn and written in a language that, you know, sounds like Chewanica to the best of the ability, because we didn't have that kind of writing until we were shown new letters. So there's lots of values to consider, and this is only one or two of the few stories. So the more you stand up, it is part of your responsibility. You live here, you live with the land. And when we talk about this transfer of knowledge, where there's always a transfer, you're part of that transfer in the cultural care. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Marilyn. That was wonderful. Oh, was that a hand, Katie?
Yeah, it was. I just wanted to thank Marilyn for that, and also say one of the reasons I brought up the fact that the park management plan is over 3 years overdue is, for me, that seems like the opportunity to open up all of these questions that we've been talking about for the last, that are emerging right here, the opportunity to do that knowledge transfer, and to identify those special places for Algonquin nations in the park and uses in the park and transferred leadership, as well as think out some of those things we were just talking about do we want to add more recreational opportunities in a phase out of logging.
How much garbage do you want to pick up?
True. I'm not saying that's why it would need to be a comprehensive. Yeah.
So you're really at an opportune time. When the Ontario Living Legacy, when that policy or when that consultation process happened, it was handled in a really good way. There was an excellent team. Chip Duncan, for those of you that might remember, and facilitator was Randy French, and the people in charge, like the people that were listening for the study, was the province. And if you go back to that book, at first the Anishinaabe people were upset because we didn't have a say. So when I looked at the book, and there's like a third of the page that pertains to First Nations application, and that was really good. So I had to think about it for a while, and it was a respectful thing to do. I see you looking at the clock, so I'll talk fast. It was a respectful thing to do in terms of revisiting. It opened the door. It was respectful because for once we didn't have somebody writing how it was going to be. We had to figure out the process, which took nothing away. We didn't lose anything. We gained something, And at the French River Visitor Center, we actually created a not-for-profit advisory committee with Ontario Parks, and that's still standing and it's growing. So there's lots of opportunity for further discussion at a different time. Correct, Anna? Thanks.
No, you're fine. I just thought a bird hit my window, so that's what caught my ear, and that's why I looked up. But I think it was a plant, some plant. The wind pushed something towards my window that I was looking at that. So thank you though for always good to know you're on 24/7 when you're on Zoom. Mathieu, I just wanted to know, do you have any comments or perspectives you want to share on working in 2 provinces? So do you have some experience? Is there something different about Quebec, or is there something like, is there anything you want to share about what it's like to work across the border?
I think it's very similar in terms of challenges. We run a lot into forestry operations, mining claims, and potential energy development. So I would say in that regard, it's very similar. But also different working groups and perspectives. So now we're talking about recreation. Do we want to allow recreation? I think that's a conversation we need to have with every stakeholder and the First Nations here, and what are the next steps forward. And there probably needs to get some policy and legislations, because I think companies won't regulate themselves.
Ain't that the truth? Dave, can you just, I know you've kind of, you touched on it a little bit. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how to get logging out of Algonquin? I just want people to understand that we're not shutting it down and kicking people out, and that there's actual thoughtful process behind it. So could you just tell people a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some opportunities. There's the unprotected old growth, that could be, especially hemlock, as Brad pointed out. Hemlock's not commercially valuable, so you could be kind of getting some of that into protection quickly. There's obviously a conversation to be had with the Algonquins of Ontario and some of the other communities. I know Gary Pritchard's community that was on earlier at Curve Lake has part of their traditional territory goes into Algonquin. So, I mean, obviously that those rights and aspirations need to be taken into consideration. And there's a huge opportunity, I think, to do restoration forestry, because forestry has been happening there on that landscape since the shutdown of the Baltic ports during the Napoleonic Wars, right? That's when they came in and started high grading the red pine and the white pine for ships' masts. So there's hundreds of years of activity that needs to be undone. And so it's even if we shut down logging, commercial logging, there's restoration that needs to happen. And so there's a lot of employment opportunities to do restoration in Algonquin, I would say, for many years. So all these, and then the provincial government has tools, right? They have land use designations that they could put on the parts that aren't really protected right now. And most maps that are honest, I love Mathieu's map of the Ottawa Valley, shows only the parts that are really protected in Algonquin. So those other parts could be put under some sort of land use designation while a process was ongoing. I've got a lot of thoughts on this, and I could go on forever. I mean, there's purposeful low grading going on in Algonquin. So the tree marking prescriptions for single tree selection, where they go in and cut a few trees at a time. I know the mill producers are hurting because they're only allowed to cut low quality wood, which is also high quality wildlife habitat. So there is some concern that woodpeckers, for example, aren't finding enough trees that have heart rot, so they can make the cavities that have all kinds of secondary and tertiary cavity users, from flying squirrels right on to marten and fisher, for some of the big holes. So I think there could be a deal struck there where we adjust the tree marking rules so that
that the really high value wildlife trees are left behind. So there's a lot of things we could do to kind of move things along. I'll stop.
I see, thank you. I see Mathieu has his hand up. Go ahead, Mathieu.
Yeah, so just to add on to what everyone is saying in terms of the next steps to work in ecological restoration, that's very important for degraded landscapes. I've worked in that field on the west coast of Vancouver Island, restoring the old growth forest. And of course, if a forest, let's say here on the East Coast, is 300, 400, 500 years old, it's probably the time it's going to take to restore to natural conditions. But there are still some indicators and things we can do, like for example, on the West Coast, a keystone species, the Pacific salmon. And so there's a lot of degraded habitat from forestry on the island, and ecological restoration can have a positive impact. And you can see salmon returning to their natal streams in the years following restoration efforts. So it's something that needs to be approached on multiple time scales.
Thank you. And we heard, oh, I see Brad wants to add a comment. We did hear also about Wolf Lake being restored yesterday. So, you know, we can see restoration work. So we know it can happen in Algonquin. We just got to put it in place. Brad, you had a burning thought?
I would just say the largest environmental remediation in Ontario's history was in Polar Bear Provincial Park, and it's incredibly hard and expensive to work there. And so the idea that it would be difficult to do in Algonquin Park, which is 3 hours from Toronto, whereas getting to Polar Bear requires 2 flights, a helicopter, and a couple of prayers, right? And we did environmental. I say we, the Ontario government, did that restoration for about $100 million of these derelict radar sites, and arguably one of the hardest working environments the province has to offer on James Bay. And so, the ability to do this closer to home in an imperiled environment that's, becoming peri-urban almost every day, given the changes in how we do development in Ontario. I don't want to leave the idea that this remediation would be difficult, but Ontario has done this really successfully before in much, much harder circumstances in terms of the conditions for doing that work. The other thing I would add, and Marilyn talks so eloquently about, the idea that there are questions to be asked and people to be asked, Indigenous people to be asked the questions that we're banding about today. Of course, the park is called Algonquin, right? It's called Algonquin Park. It's been called Algonquin Park for 100 years. And yet the park management plan, which is now 3 years overdue, really has never included the inclusion of the Algonquins of Ontario or any of the other Indigenous sovereign nations in which that territory, Algonquin Park, finds itself. And so, I've always considered that to be, a very difficult position for the government, and one that has to be rectified. I'd also point out that the park management plan doesn't mention climate change. And so, if we're talking about the fact that it's overdue, there's any number of things that plan needs to take into account. And so commercial logging use is what we're discussing today. But the wholesale redo of that plan is really got to be from the ground up, because it's quite inadequate in its current form.
There are several Indigenous people that hold the Order of Ontario, and several other awards. We have Indigenous Ontario people and local, who are senators in some of the bigger commission process. We do have local and close by people in Ontario and surrounding on the Algonquin lands. And maybe that's what we need to start referring to, the lands, the traditional lands there. Parks is, I don't even know if we have a word for that. Well, there are several words that we don't have words for in our language because we didn't know what they were, and parks is one of them. So when we talk about just setting aside, we call that squagmakwe, and that is Earth Woman. That's how we relate to that. So it's time to be creative together. Yeah. And the other thing too, we're coming up for an Ontario election pretty soon, and there's no time like now. Instead of people promising you all kinds of things when they get into that leadership corridor, that race. Now is a time to do a collective collaboration of people, a circle of people, and ask, the important questions like you're talking about today. They have to be asked, because those are the people when they get into those places of speaking on your behalf. You have to really wonder: are you talking for me, or are you talking for the bank? I would be that bold to ask that. They only shoot you once, don't they? Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
Thank you, Marilyn. I think that's a good question to end the session on. Good inspiration for people going forward. I'm going to end it here and just say thank you to the panelists, and thank you, Marilyn. I'm just going to hand it back to Brad and he can sign us off.
That's great. What a wonderful discussion. And of course, I'm sitting here in Toronto and we're all sitting in different places. And other than Marilyn, who's on the Georgian Bay shore, a lot of us probably wish we were in Algonquin Park right now. It's always great we're talking about these protected spaces and we're not actually in them at the time. Dave and Peter and Marilyn, Mathieu and Katie, thank you very, very much. It's great to have you engaged. You brought a wonderful nuance and a mosaic of perspectives to this conversation. It's a really important conversation, and it's one that's been going on for most of my lifetime. And so, it's nice to see that there's still a strong passion for it. And of course, that strong passion is going to have to continue because there's a lot of work left to go. Marilyn gave us a very important mandate to look forward from, and we really appreciate that. And so thank you to everybody, and enjoy the remaining sessions, and I will close off today.
One more thing.
Yes, Marilyn.
You didn't catch that llama yet. Okay, so there's nothing to fear. It takes a couple of days before they catch up with you. We did see it running on the highway, so it is a true story. You didn't catch it.
And just so everyone knows, the next session starts at 3 o'clock, so please come back. More good speakers, and then we're going to end the day. So don't go away.
Thank you very much,
everybody.
everyone. Thank you.